There is a file. It exists, or it did exist, inside a locked steel cabinet in the sub-basement records room of a government archive building in Washington, D.C., a building that no longer carries the same name it carried in 1909. The file is thin, 21 pages. And the man who compiled those pages came back from somewhere he was never supposed to return from, carrying the smell of wet earth in his coat lining for the rest of his life, a smell his wife noticed on the day he walked through the door, and that she would still describe 30 years later in a single quiet sentence to her youngest daughter. It smelled, she said, like something had just been buried. Wherever you are watching this right now, whatever hour it is, whatever room you're sitting in, we would be glad to know. Drop it in the comments. The city, the time. It matters more than you might think, because what we are about to explore is a story about how ordinary people, in ordinary places at ordinary hours, can disappear into something that leaves no satisfactory explanation behind. This is not a ghost story. It is something considerably more uncomfortable than that. In the spring of 1907, Washington, D.C. was a city in the middle of becoming something it had not yet decided to be. The great expansion of the federal government that would define the early 20th century was already underway. Theodore Roosevelt had spent 6 years reshaping the executive branch into a more muscular interventionist institution, and the buildings going up along Pennsylvania Avenue and the National Mall carried in their stone facades a kind of institutional confidence that the country had not previously worn so openly. There were new departments, new agencies, new bureaus. There were men in suits carrying leather satchels who occupied offices that had not existed a decade earlier, doing work that had no precise precedent and that they were, in many cases, making up as they proceeded. It was a city of paper. That is the first thing to understand. The federal government ran on documentation, on reports and memoranda and interdepartmental correspondence and field dispatches that arrived by post and telegraph from offices and agents scattered across a country that was, in the first decade of the new century, still in the process of absorbing its own western territories into something resembling administrative order. The territories of New Mexico and Arizona would not become states for another 5 years. Alaska was a district, not yet organized into something governable in the conventional sense, and there were portions of the American interior, portions that had been charted technically and assigned coordinates and recorded in the survey books, that remained, in practical terms, almost entirely unknown to the apparatus of the federal government that nominally held jurisdiction over them. Into this world came a man named Edmund Aldous Voss. He was 34 years old in 1907. He had been born in Cincinnati in 1873, the second son of a German-American bookkeeper and a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania Dutch country, a woman who had, by all family accounts, an exceptional memory and a deep suspicion of anything she could not categorize. Voss inherited both qualities. He had attended the University of Michigan, where he studied geography and what was then called political economy, and he had come to Washington in 1899 on a competitive civil service appointment, taking a position in the Bureau of the Census that was modest in its initial scope. But that suited him precisely. He was the kind of man who was comfortable with data, not excited by it in the way that a mathematician might be excited by an elegant proof, but comfortable. The way a carpenter is comfortable with the smell of wood shavings, the way a surgeon is comfortable with the weight of instruments. Data was the medium in which Voss worked, and he worked in it without self-consciousness or drama. He was, by all available descriptions, unremarkable in appearance. Medium height, medium build, brown hair that had begun its retreat from his forehead sometime around his 30th birthday. He wore spectacles with round wire frames. He dressed neatly but without ostentation. His colleagues in the Bureau, and later, after his transfer in 1904, in the newly formed Division of Territorial Records within the Department of the Interior, described him in terms that cluster around a particular set of adjectives: careful, methodical, quiet, reliable. One supervisor, in a 1906 performance review that has survived in Interior Department personnel files, noted that Voss was possessed of a peculiar capacity for patience, which renders him well suited to extended fieldwork in conditions that would discourage men of less settled disposition. That note, written in November of 1906, is the last assessment of Edmund Voss before he left for the field. He was assigned in January of 1907 to conduct what the division called a reconciliation survey, a bureaucratic term for a specific kind of administrative task that involved traveling to a designated territory, comparing the existing federal records against actual conditions on the ground, and producing a standardized report that would allow the division to update its files. The territory in question was a section of the Upper Sonoran Plateau region in what is now northeastern Arizona, a stretch of land that had been the subject of several earlier survey expeditions in the 1880s and 1890s, all of which had produced incomplete or inconsistent results. There were land grant claims on record that did not correspond to verifiable settlements. There were population figures that did not align with later enumerations. There were, in one instance, two completely contradictory maps of the same canyon system produced by two different survey teams in the same decade, neither of which had been officially superseded or withdrawn. Voss was given a budget, a set of existing records to work from, a letter of introduction to the territorial governor's office in Phoenix, and a departure date of the 14th of February 1907. His wife Clara saw him off at Union Station. They had been married for 6 years. They had one child, a daughter named Ruth, who was 4 years old and who, according to Clara's later account, kept asking where her father was going and receiving the answer that he was going to look at some maps and make sure they were correct. This seemed to satisfy the child. It was the kind of answer, Clara would reflect, that seemed entirely appropriate at the time, precise, true, and completely inadequate to what followed. Voss traveled by train to Chicago, then south and west through Kansas City and Albuquerque, arriving in Flagstaff, Arizona Territory, on the 21st of February after a journey of 7 days. He had brought with him 2 trunks of equipment and reference materials, surveying instruments, a portable writing desk, copies of all the relevant existing records, a personal journal in which he intended to maintain daily notes, and a Kodak No. 3A folding pocket camera, one of the newer models that used postcard format film. He also brought a small library of his own choosing, a volume on the geology of the Colorado Plateau, a recent archaeological monograph on prehistoric Pueblo cultures, and a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that he had carried since university and that contained in his own handwriting marginal annotations going back 15 years. Flagstaff in February of 1907 was a small, cold, high-altitude railroad town. It sat at nearly 7,000 feet, and the San Francisco peaks to the north still carried substantial snow on their upper slopes. It had grown around the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad depot and served primarily as a supply and transit point for the ranching and timber operations of the surrounding region. It had a main street with the usual complement of hotels, saloons, a general merchant, a hardware store, and a small number of more specialized establishments that served the particular needs of a community living at the edge of one of the most geologically dramatic landscapes in North America. Voss checked into the Weatherford Hotel, which had opened just the previous year and was regarded as the finest accommodation available, and spent 2 days making preparations before hiring a guide and purchasing additional supplies for the overland journey east and north into the Plateau country. The guide's name was Thomas Harker. He was a man of perhaps 50, a former Army scout who had spent 30 years in the territories and who spoke, in addition to English, passable Navajo and several words of Hopi. He was lean and weathered and largely silent, in the way of men who have spent most of their adult lives in landscape that discourages unnecessary speech. Voss found him acceptable. Harker found Voss, based on their initial interview, organized and not foolish, which was high praise by the standards of the guides who regularly dealt with government men from the east, arriving in the territories with leather satchels full of paper and a profound ignorance of what the paper was describing. They departed Flagstaff on the 24th of February with 2 horses, 2 pack mules, and enough supplies for 6 weeks. Voss had estimated the survey would require 4 to 5 weeks. The additional week was Harker's insistence, non-negotiable. The terrain they moved into was extraordinary in its severity and its beauty, and Voss documented it in his journal with a precision that suggests someone genuinely struck by what he was seeing. The Colorado Plateau in late winter presents itself as a series of nested landscapes, each one opening out of the previous one in a way that defeats expectation. The high pine forest around Flagstaff gives way as you move east and descend in elevation to an open juniper and pinyon woodland, the trees becoming smaller and more scattered, the ground between them increasingly rocky, the soil increasingly red. Further east, the woodland thins into near desert, the plateau surface broken by dramatic formations, mesas with vertical red sandstone walls, dry washes cutting deep into the earth, volcanic cinder cones scattered across the plain in arrangements that suggest some ancient, barely comprehensible violence. And at intervals, rising from the plateau floor on their defensive promontories or tucked under overhanging cliff faces, the ruins of structures built by people who had been gone from this landscape for 600 years. Voss noted the ruins repeatedly and with evident interest, though not the interest of an archaeologist. It was a surveyor's interest, a geographer's interest, the interest of a man trying to understand why people chose to build where they built, and what the landscape looked like from inside those structures, and whether the maps in his trunks corresponded to what he could see with his own eyes. Often, he recorded, they did not. The first 3 weeks of the survey proceeded without incident. Voss and Harker moved methodically through the designated territory, stopping at the locations indicated in the existing records, measuring, photographing, noting discrepancies, interviewing the few settlers and ranchers they encountered. The population in the survey area was sparse, perhaps 40 or 50 people spread across an area of several hundred square miles, most of them Navajo families with seasonal grazing rights, a handful of Anglo ranchers with small herds, 2 or 3 Hopi men who came and went with an independence that suggested they regarded the survey area's federal designation as essentially irrelevant to their own sense of where they were and what they were doing there. The weather in March was unpredictable. Several days of cold rain, one afternoon of unseasonable warmth that brought out a startling number of birds, nights that dropped to near freezing even as the days climbed into the 60s. Voss noted the conditions faithfully as he noted everything else. His journal from these weeks is detailed and orderly, the handwriting consistent, the observations careful and largely dispassionate. He notes distances and elevations, describes geological formations, records the names and approximate locations of the people he speaks to, summarizes their statements. He also occasionally records something more personal, a description of the quality of light at a particular hour on a particular day, the sound of wind moving through a canyon, the strange completeness of silence in the plateau country on a clear night when no wind was blowing and the stars were visible from horizon to horizon in a way that is simply not possible in the East. These passages are distinguished from the surrounding material by their tone. They are the passages of a man who is, quietly, being changed by what he is seeing. On the 15th of March, according to his journal, Voss and Harker reached the western edge of a canyon system that appeared on one of the older survey maps under the designation Canyon Sequence, Northern Branch Unclassified, see Addendum. The addendum, when Voss located it in his records, proved to be a single handwritten note attached to the back of the map with a rusted pin, unsigned and undated, that read, Interior Passage, Access Restricted per Territorial Order. Do not survey. The territorial order referenced was not included in the files. Voss noted this discrepancy with characteristic precision and then, with equal precision, noted that in the absence of a current order from the Division of Territorial Records, he would proceed with the survey as assigned. Harker, when informed of this decision, was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that the Navajo families in the area regarded the inner sections of that canyon complex as a place they did not go. He said this without elaboration or apparent emotion. Voss asked if there was a specific reason for this avoidance. Harker said that as far as he understood, it was old, older than the current generation's memory. He said there were places in this country that people had decided over a very long time not to visit, and that in his experience those decisions were usually not arbitrary. Voss recorded this exchange in his journal and continued his preparations for entering the canyon. He entered it alone. This was not a sudden decision, but a deliberate one, recorded in the journal the night before with the kind of methodical reasoning that characterized everything Voss wrote. Harker was experiencing a significant swelling in his right knee, an old injury, he said, aggravated by the cold, and was not capable of the descent into the canyon interior that the survey required. Voss judged the terrain manageable for a solo traverse, estimated the survey of the inner canyon would require 2 to 3 days, and instructed Harker to make camp at the canyon rim and wait. He took 3 days of food, his surveying instruments, his camera, and his journal. He left behind both trunks, his personal library, his spare clothes, and most of his equipment. He descended into the canyon on the morning of the 16th of March. Thomas Harker waited. On the first day he waited without concern. On the second day he waited with moderate concern. On the third day he waited with serious concern and considered descending into the canyon himself. But his knee had worsened, and the route down was, he judged, beyond his current physical capacity. On the fourth day he made the decision to ride to the nearest settlement, a Navajo family's winter camp approximately 12 miles to the northwest, and send for help. The search that followed involved, ultimately, 4 Navajo men who knew the canyon terrain well, 2 Anglo ranchers from the area, and a deputy from the territorial sheriff's office who arrived on the 6th day after Voss's disappearance and took charge of coordinating the effort with the decisive competence of a man who had managed searches in this country before and harbored no illusions about what the typical outcomes were. They found no trace of Edmund Voss in the canyon's inner passages. No footprints, no discarded food wrappers or equipment, no sign of injury, no sign of struggle, no indication that he had fallen or been caught in a flash flood. The weather had been dry and clear throughout. The canyon interior was rocky enough that the absence of footprints was not, in itself, conclusive evidence of anything, but the absence of any sign whatsoever, not a disturbance of dust, not a displaced stone, not a single photograph left behind where a photographer would logically have taken photographs, was noted by all the searchers as strange. The deputy filed his report on the 28th of March. He concluded, with the economy that characterized official documentation in the territories, that Voss was missing under unknown circumstances, presumed lost in the canyon interior, cause undetermined. A copy of the report was sent to the sheriff in Flagstaff, who forwarded it to the territorial governor's office, which forwarded it to the Department of the Interior in Washington. The Division of Territorial Records received notification on the 14th of April 1907 that their surveyor was missing and presumed dead. Clara Voss was informed by letter on the 16th of April. She was 29 years old. Ruth was 4. The letter expressed regret in the manner of letters expressing regret from government departments in 1907, formally, briefly, and without particular warmth. Edmund Voss had been gone for approximately 6 weeks. He came back on the 9th of June. He walked into the office of the Coconino County Sheriff in Flagstaff at approximately 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, in the clothes he had been wearing when he entered the canyon. The same dark wool trousers, the same brown canvas jacket, the same boots. The clothes were worn and stained but not destroyed. He was thinner than he had been, noticeably thinner, with the drawn, careful quality of a man who has been ill or who has subsisted for a period on inadequate food. His spectacles were missing. He had grown a beard that was now more than 2 months long. He walked to the desk and gave his name and his employer, and asked to send a telegram to the Department of the Interior in Washington, informing them that he had completed his survey and was returning. The deputy who received him, not the same man who had managed the search, but a younger man named Clifford Reese, who had been in the office less than a year, later described the encounter in a letter to his brother in Kansas City. He wrote that what struck him immediately was not Voss's appearance but his manner. He was, Reese wrote, entirely calm. Not the stunned calm of a man in shock, not the frantic calm of a man suppressing hysteria, but something that Reese found more difficult to characterize. He was calm the way a room is calm after everyone has left it. He answered questions directly and without elaboration. He did not seem confused about where he was or what year it was. He accepted a glass of water. He asked once about the status of his trunks and equipment, which had been held in storage by the deputy from the earlier search, and when told they were available, he said only, "good," and did not ask any further questions about them. When Reese asked him where he had been, Voss said that he had been conducting his survey. When Reese pointed out that the survey had been declared lost, and that Voss had been missing for nearly 3 months, Voss said that the survey had taken longer than expected. He said this without apparent distress or awareness that it was an inadequate explanation. When Reese pressed him, gently he noted, because the man did not seem entirely well and Reese did not want to agitate him, Voss said that he had experienced some difficulty with the return route and had spent additional time in the canyon interior before finding his way out. He said the canyon was larger than the existing maps indicated. He then asked again about sending the telegram. The sheriff was summoned. He was a man named Wallace Braddock, experienced and not easily rattled, who had been in the county for 20 years and who had handled the original notification of Voss's disappearance himself. He sat with Voss for the better part of an hour. He later told the deputy that Voss had answered every question fully and that not one of those answers had told him a single thing he wanted to know. He said Voss was present in his body, but absent in some other way that I can't rightly describe to you, being as I'm a sheriff and not a philosopher. Voss was examined by a physician named Dr. Howard Kessler, who maintained the only medical practice in Flagstaff at the time. Kessler's examination notes have survived. They are part of a collection of his records donated to the Arizona Historical Society in 1951, and they are notable for their combination of clinical detail and expressed bewilderment. Kessler recorded that Voss showed signs of significant weight loss, approximately 20 to 25 pounds below what Kessler estimated his healthy weight to have been. His muscle condition was consistent with extended physical activity. He showed no signs of dehydration, no signs of infection, no unusual skin conditions, no injuries, no evidence of head trauma that might explain memory difficulties. His eyes were responsive and tracking correctly. His reflexes were normal. His speech was clear. His pulse was strong and slightly slow, the pulse, Kessler wrote, of a man who has recently been exerting himself considerably in open country. What Kessler found harder to record, and what he returned to twice in his notes with evident discomfort, was Voss's affective state. He wrote that Voss does not present with the distress one would expect in a man of his background and circumstances, having been isolated in wilderness for 12 weeks without his original equipment or adequate provisions. He wrote that this absence of distress was itself a matter for concern, and that in his opinion, Voss should be observed carefully over the following weeks, as his emotional responses may represent a delayed reaction to experiences of which he is not yet fully conscious. He noted that Voss cooperated fully with the examination and was polite throughout, and that his politeness had the quality of distance rather than engagement. The telegram was sent. Voss recovered his trunks. He stayed in Flagstaff for 3 days, during which time he ate regular meals, slept without apparent difficulty, and spent most of his waking hours at the hotel's small writing desk working on his report. The hotel clerk noticed that he wrote for very long periods without stopping, and that he did not ring for anything during these periods. Not food, not coffee, not anything. He simply wrote. He left on the 12th of June by train, arriving in Washington on the 19th. Clara was at Union Station with Ruth, who did not recognize her father at first, partly because of the beard, which he had trimmed but not removed, and partly for reasons that Clara would be less willing to articulate in any of her subsequent accounts. She said only, always, that he was different. When pressed for specifics, she would say that he was quieter, and then she would seem to reconsider, and she would say that it was not exactly that he was quieter. He had always been a quiet man, but that the silence around him had changed in some quality she could not name. He returned to his desk at the Division of Territorial Records on the 23rd of June. His supervisor, a man named Arthur Pemberton, who had been with the division since its founding, wrote a brief note in Voss's personnel file on that date, recording his return and noting that he had sustained no injuries incompatible with continued service and appears fully capable of resuming his duties. This note has the slightly hasty quality of a document written by someone who was relieved to be able to write something simple and definitive, even if the simplicity required a certain selective attention to the available evidence. Voss submitted his report on the 4th of July 1907, having spent 11 days writing and organizing it after his return to Washington. The report was 21 pages long, hand-typed on government stationery with attached photographs developed from the film he had brought back in his camera. The photographs are one of the most discussed elements of the case by the small number of people who have had occasion to discuss it at all. There were 47 photographs in total, which is a remarkable number for a solo field survey of limited duration. The photographs that covered the first 3 weeks of the survey, the open plateau country, the ruins, the ranches, the Navajo camps, the canyon approaches, were unremarkable, well composed, technically competent. The photographs taken inside the canyon interior, of which there were 19, were different in a way that initially resists precise description. They were well exposed. The composition was careful and deliberate, as the composition of all Voss's photographs was. They showed geological formations, passage walls, floor surfaces, several of the small alcoves and chambers that opened off the main canyon passages. They showed what appeared to be evidence of prehistoric human habitation, pottery fragments, what looked like the remnants of a structure built into a cliff face, several petroglyph panels on a wall of red sandstone. Nothing in any of the photographs was visibly extraordinary, and yet, the archivist at the Department of the Interior, who processed the photographs in July of 1907, a woman named Agnes Hartwell, who had been cataloging field survey materials for 9 years, wrote a note to her supervisor that has survived among the department's administrative correspondence files. In it, she wrote that she was uncertain how to classify the photographs from the canyon interior and was requesting guidance. When her supervisor asked for clarification, she wrote a second note. In this second note, she wrote that the photographs were difficult to evaluate because something in their composition creates an effect of ambiguity regarding scale and spatial relationship that I have not encountered in previous survey photography, and that I am unable to attribute to any technical flaw in the equipment or the exposure process. She was not a person who used language carelessly. The second note is 3 paragraphs long, and in its final paragraph she wrote something that has been the subject of consideration by everyone who has subsequently read it. I cannot with confidence determine, in looking at certain of these photographs, whether I am looking at something very large seen from a considerable distance or something very small seen from very close. The spatial logic that one ordinarily brings to the interpretation of a landscape photograph does not resolve as it should. I find that extended examination of these images produces a mild but genuine discomfort, which I attribute to the visual system's frustrated attempt to achieve that resolution. The photographs were filed. They are almost certainly still in those files, in the sub-basement of whatever building now holds the relevant archive. The report itself was reviewed by Arthur Pemberton and 2 other senior division officers over the course of July. Their written responses to the report have not survived in the form of a single comprehensive document, but references to their reviews appear in meeting minutes and internal correspondence from that period, and those references suggest that the report was received with considerable unease. Not because its content was overtly alarming. It was not. It was organized, referenced, carefully argued, but its content did not align with the established records in ways that had simple explanations. The 21 facts that Voss presented in his reconciliation report were, on their face, Administrative conclusions. Determinations about the accuracy or inaccuracy of existing federal records relating to the survey area. Several of them were routine. A land grant claim that corresponded to no verifiable property, a population figure that was clearly an error, a map coordinate that had been transposed. These were the kinds of discrepancies that reconciliation surveys were designed to find, and finding them was unremarkable. But others were not routine. Fact 7 in the report stated that a specific section of the canyon complex had been in active and continuous use as a habitation site for a period that the physical evidence suggested was substantially longer than any existing archaeological or historical record indicated, that the evidence, if correctly interpreted, pushed occupation back into a time frame that conflicted not merely with the existing survey records, but with the established scholarly consensus about prehistoric human habitation in the region. Voss was careful to note that he was not an archaeologist and that his conclusions should be reviewed by qualified specialists, but the photographic evidence he attached was specific and detailed. Fact 12 stated that the restricted addendum attached to the 1887 survey map, the unsigned note that had said not to survey the interior passage, appeared to have been placed on the map not as a formal administrative directive, but as a personal warning left by someone who had been in the canyon and who was, Voss wrote, attempting through informal means to prevent subsequent survey personnel from entering an area that the individual in question had found disturbing. He had found, he wrote, in the canyon interior, a separate set of written materials that he had brought back with him, materials which he described as notes left in a protected location by an unidentified individual, apparently during an earlier survey expedition, the contents of which have a direct bearing on the question of the restricted addendum. These notes were not attached to the report. They were referenced twice in the document and then not again. Fact 17 stated that the canyon complex contained, in its deeper interior sections, evidence of a series of structured spaces, built spaces, not natural formations, whose construction technique and material composition did not correspond to any known prehistoric or historic building tradition in the regional archaeological record. Voss described these spaces in careful, clinical language that managed simultaneously to convey their strangeness and his own uncertainty about how to classify them. He noted that he had photographed them extensively, and that the photographs were filed separately under a restricted designation that he had applied on his own authority, citing a provision of the division's field survey guidelines that allowed senior survey officers to restrict materials pending specialist review when those materials related to matters of potential archaeological or cultural sensitivity. The restricted photographs are not in the main file. No record of their subsequent location has been found. Fact 21, the final fact in the report, was a single paragraph, shorter than all the others, and it stated the following: that in the course of his survey of the canyon interior, Voss had encountered evidence that the area had been the subject of at least one previous formal survey that had produced a complete report, and that this report had been submitted to the Department of the Interior at some point before 1900, and that this report did not appear in any of the division's records, not in the files he had been given before departure, not in the central catalogue he had checked on his return, not in any of the filing systems he had access to. He could not explain its absence. He noted only that it had existed, and that someone had known it existed and had chosen not to include it in the materials given to him, and that this omission was either an administrative error of a significant kind or something else. He did not say what the something else might be. The report was marked as received, filed, and referred for specialist review. The specialist review, if it was conducted, left no documentary trace. The report itself remained in the division's files until the division was reorganized in 1913, and its records were consolidated with several other Interior Department offices. At that point, the bulk of the Reconciliation Survey reports were moved to General Archive storage. Voss's report was among them, in the sense that it was noted in the transfer manifest. Whether it arrived at its listed destination is less certain. In the weeks and months following Voss's return to his desk, his colleagues noticed changes in him that were consistent in their broad outline with the observations of Dr. Kessler and the sheriff and the hotel clerk in Flagstaff. He was doing his work, and he was doing it well. Pemberton's quarterly reviews continued to describe his performance as excellent. He came in on time, he met his deadlines, he asked appropriate questions and gave appropriate answers. He was not, by the observable standards of a government office in 1907, behaving unusually. The strangeness was in the texture of things. A colleague named Francis Dowd, who sat at a desk adjacent to Voss's in the division's main workroom, would later recall, in a 1935 oral history interview that forms part of a Georgetown University archive of civil service reminiscences, that Voss had become, after his return from Arizona, a man who seemed to be paying attention to things that weren't there. He said this carefully, knowing how it sounded, and clarified that he did not mean Voss was delusional or that he was experiencing visions. He meant that Voss's attention sometimes moved toward a point in a room or a corner of a document or a quality of the afternoon light with a focused, considered quality that seemed to be responding to something specific, and that whatever it was responding to, it was not accessible to anyone around him. Clara's account of those months, gathered from conversations she had with her younger sister over many years and summarized in a letter the sister wrote in 1952, describes a man who was, in the domestic sphere, present and functional and not unkind. He helped with Ruth. He ate his meals and complimented the food. He was not cold or withholding in any way that could be easily specified, but he had become, she said, impossible to reach, not in the emotional sense that might suggest grief or depression. In a more literal sense, she said that in conversation, she would feel that she was making contact with something, with a thought, a presence, an awareness, and then, without any visible transition, the contact would be gone, and she would be talking to a surface. She said it reminded her, in some strange way, of talking to someone in a foreign language that both of you spoke imperfectly, where you were never quite sure that the words you were using meant the same thing to both of you. He began, in the evenings, to write, not for work. He had a separate small desk in the second bedroom that served as a study, and after dinner he would sit there, sometimes for 2 hours, sometimes for 3, writing in a series of notebooks he purchased from a stationer's on K Street. These notebooks were not his official journal, which had been submitted as part of the survey documentation. They were personal. Clara never read them. He did not invite her to. When he died, which was many years later in 1941, of pneumonia at the age of 68, the notebooks were not found among his papers. Ruth, who was by then 38 years old, and who had her mother's methodical quality and her father's patience, searched thoroughly. There were 34 years of evenings potentially represented in those notebooks, and they were simply gone. Whether he destroyed them himself, or whether something else happened to them, is not known. In 1909, Voss was promoted within the division and took on a supervisory role that reduced his fieldwork obligations. He traveled occasionally, short trips, never to the southwest, and returned promptly. His career continued on its upward, unremarkable trajectory through the reorganization of 1913, through the war years, through the various bureaucratic reshufflings of the 20s. He retired in 1938 at the age of 65, with a small pension and a commendation letter from the Secretary of the Interior that cited his long and distinguished service to the accurate administration of the nation's territorial records. At the retirement party, held in the division's conference room on a Friday afternoon in October of 1938, with cake from a bakery on Pennsylvania Avenue and a speech by his supervisor that was, by all accounts, warm, if somewhat generic, a younger colleague named Paul Whitmore asked Voss, in the semi-private manner of a conversation that is happening at the edge of a social gathering, whether there was any particular survey from his field days that he remembered with special clarity. It was the kind of question people ask at retirement parties, an invitation to reminisce, to perform the nostalgia that the occasion requires. Voss considered the question for a moment with the specific quality of consideration that Whitmore would later describe as not like remembering but like deciding. Then he said that there was one. Yes. He said it was in Arizona, a long time ago. He said the country there was extraordinary. Whitmore waited, and when nothing more came, asked what had made the survey memorable. Voss said, "The scale of things." He paused and then added, "You think you understand the scale of things, and then you go somewhere that makes it clear that you don't. And after that, everything looks different. The size of things, the age of things, things you thought were reliable reference points." Whitmore waited again. Voss turned back to the cake. "That was all. There is one more element of this story, and it is the one that shifts the frame of everything that precedes it. In 1962, a researcher named Dorothy Fenn, who was completing a doctoral dissertation on federal administration of the Southwestern Territories between 1880 and 1920, was working through Interior Department records at the National Archives. She was looking for reconciliation survey reports as part of a chapter on administrative accuracy in the territorial period, and in the course of that research, she came across a reference in a 1908 Division of Territorial Records meeting minute to a survey report described only as the Voss file, status pending specialist review. She found the main report in General Archive storage, as described, accessible, filed correctly, bearing the marks of its various transfers and refilings. She also found, attached to the back of the main file folder with a steel pin, rusted as the pin on the 1887 map addendum had been rusted, a single sheet of paper that did not correspond to any of the documented contents of the file. The sheet was not in Voss's handwriting. Fenn, who had spent enough time with the file to be familiar with his hand, was certain of this. The handwriting was older-looking, more formal, the script of someone trained in an earlier generation's penmanship conventions. The paper was different from the government stationery that comprised the rest of the file, thicker, with a slightly cream-colored quality that suggested it was not government-issued. The sheet contained a list, not numbered, not organized under any heading, just a list of 21 brief phrases or descriptors, arranged one under the other in a vertical column in that careful older handwriting, as if someone had been itemizing things they had seen or learned or needed to record, quickly, before the opportunity was gone. Fenn copied the list into her research notes. It subsequently appeared in a footnote in her dissertation, filed at Georgetown University in 1964. Her dissertation was not widely read outside the specific field of territorial administration history. The list is unusual for several reasons. Its items do not read as administrative notations. They are not place names, coordinates, or bureaucratic categorizations. They read more like the kinds of entries a person might make in a personal journal when trying to compress an experience into its essential components, before the full account can be written. Several of the items are spatial or perceptual in nature, descriptions of dimensions or relationships between things that resist conventional spatial logic. Several are temporal, in a way that is hard to characterize, references to sequences and durations that seem internally inconsistent. A few are entirely opaque, words or phrases that do not pass into clear meaning in any obvious interpretive framework. The 21st item on the list, the final one, consists of 4 words. Fenn noted them in her dissertation footnote and expressed uncertainty about their meaning. The 4 words are, "He was already there." There is no established interpretation of this phrase in the context of the file. There is no agreement among the few people who have looked carefully at this material about who he refers to, or what already signifies, or what it means to say that someone was there in a place that the available evidence suggests was, at the time of the original surveys, definitively uninhabited. Edmund Voss died in January of 1941. He's buried in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, a quiet place with large old trees and a particular quality of winter stillness. His stone gives his name, his dates, and nothing else. The photographs remain unfound. The restricted section of his report, the 18 pages that the transfer manifest describes, but that do not appear in the archive box, has not been located in any subsequent search. The earlier report that Voss described, in fact 21, the report that someone knew about and chose not to include in his pre-departure briefing materials, has not been found in any federal archive that has been searched. Thomas Harker, the guide who waited at the canyon rim, was interviewed once by the territorial sheriff during the original search and gave a statement that was included in the sheriff's report. In that statement, as the deputy noted it, Harker said only that he had waited, that no one had come back, and that he had sent for help when it was clear no one was coming back. He made no other statements about the survey or about Edmund Voss. He left the Flagstaff area sometime in 1908 and does not appear in any subsequent record. The canyon is still there. It has a designation in current federal records. It is part of a larger protected area. It receives, presumably, occasional visitors, hikers, researchers, photographers. The inner passages are described in the current land management literature as archaeologically significant, access restricted pending survey completion. The survey apparently is still pending. What we are left with is this. A careful man, trained in the precise discipline of comparing what records say to what the land actually holds, went into a place that someone had quietly warned others away from, and came back carrying something that he spent the rest of his life working out how to hold. Not a monster, not a supernatural visitation, something more patient and more permanent than either of those things, something that had to do with scale, with age, with the particular vertigo that comes when the reference points you have used to orient yourself in the world turn out to have been considerably less fixed than you had believed. The file exists. The man existed. The list on the back of the file folder, in handwriting that is not his, exists. And somewhere in whatever archive currently holds whatever remains of a steel cabinet from a division that was reorganized 100 years ago, there is a restricted photograph, or there were 19 restricted photographs, of a space inside a canyon whose interior dimensions, according to the archivist who processed them in the summer of 1907, do not resolve in the way that a human being looking at a photograph expects them to resolve. What Edmund Voss saw in those interior spaces during the 12 weeks he does not fully account for, we cannot know. What it cost him, we can measure only in the periphery of other people's descriptions. A wife who said the silence around him changed. A colleague who said his attention moved toward things that weren't there. A daughter who found, after his death, 34 years of evenings missing from his study. What the person who made the list on the back of the file folder saw or knew or was trying to record, who wrote those 21 phrases in an older hand on a cream-colored paper that was not government-issued, and how that paper came to be attached with a rusted pin to the back of a file compiled by a man who was not born when the handwriting conventions of that script were taught, remains, and will likely remain, the question that this particular file will not answer. The last entry in Voss's personal journal, the official survey journal, the one that was submitted as documentation, was made on the 15th of March, 1907, the day before he entered the canyon. It is a brief entry, describing the weather, the condition of the horses, the distance remaining to the canyon rim. At the bottom of the page, below the regular entry, he wrote one additional line in slightly smaller script, as if it were an afterthought, or as if it were something he wanted to note but was uncertain about including. Harker says the quiet here is different from ordinary quiet. I believe I understand what he means. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The journal has no entries after that date.